guys, welcome back to the channel. This week we're going to be talking about Republicans. And so Republicans are a very different group than the Democrats that we previously talked about. The origins of the Republicans are pretty good. To get started and to understand our grand narrative we've been kind of weaving since the very beginning, we really need to look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because this is kind of like what really ticked off a lot of people in the North, and it's what was the impetus for the spawning of the Republican Party. And so the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854, and essentially what that did is it obliterated something that was known as the Missouri Compromise, which would allow states below Missouri, below the latitude of the southern latitude of Missouri, to become slave states, and those above that had to become free as they were entering and pushing towards this manifest destiny and all that. And so this caused a problem because the Democrats looked at the map and they realized that there's not actually a ton of space below Missouri, you know? And so they believed that if a state wanted to be a slave-holding state, then they should be allowed. So because of this, the Kansas-Nebraska Act got passed, which was passed by Democrats and essentially allowed Kansas and Nebraska to enter into the Union as slave states if they wanted, and they did. This ticked off a lot of people in the North because they had come to the agreement of the Missouri Compromise. And this caused a lot of issues. And the prominent party at the time was the Whig Party. There was the Whigs and the Democrats. And so the Democrats during this time were beginning to split between the more racist and more outraged people in the South, and then people like Stephen Douglas in the North, who were still racist, but they wanted to keep the Union intact. They wanted to keep the Union intact because they really liked the monetary system that was happening, they really liked the innovation that was happening, but they also liked the fact that there were a lot of slaves. And so there was a lot of problems with slavery in the way that representation in the South was not true representation of the actual body politic in the South. And so this was causing a big rift as well, because people in the North were upset this idea that in the South could count toward representation in the House of Representatives. And now this was a problem because it means that a large majority of the population being counted toward membership in the House of Representatives for these southern states were a group of people that couldn't even vote and really couldn't even participate in society in any meaningful way. And so the Northerners saw a problem with this and saw a huge problem with that expanding. And so you get a lot of free soil, which we talked about briefly in the last one, which was a coalition of Whigs that were upset and Democrats that were upset. And then they wanted to form a party that said, hey, these lands up here to the north, or that we're gaining through manifest destiny, should be free land. That is, no slaves. And so they wanted this because they wanted these new places entering the Union, one, to be properly representative of the people that live there, and two, they wanted to expand industry. And so it's a lot easier to expand industry if you have backing from international people, and if you have backing from a broader labor force that's willing to work for you willingly. Industry doesn't really work when the labor is forced. And it doesn't work because productivity falls. I don't want to dig into all the reasons why even like an underpaid workforce is far better than a forced labor situation, because that seems like pretty common sense. Slavery is bad, even from an industrial perspective. These people came together because they were disheartened with the way things were going, They didn't like the Whig Party. That was kind of falling apart. We get introduced to two very important characters in the foundation of the Republican Party. We get a guy named Zachariah Chandler. Zachariah Chandler had a very strong opposition to slavery. He was a former member of the Whig Party, and post-Civil War, he was in Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, and he was actually put in charge of a lot of purging of the executive branch. He was a member of the founding committee that founded the Republican Party. And another member of this founding committee of the Republican Party was a guy named Salmon P. Chase. And Salmon P. Chase was an abolitionist lawyer. He defended fugitive slaves. He was a member of the Free Soil Party. And so we can kind of see that this coalition that's making up the Republicans is disaffected Democrats and disaffected Whigs that did not believe that the Union was doing enough to keep the South at bay. Salmon P. Chase was a very important figure during this time. He held a position in all three of the constitutional branches of government, those being he was the Secretary of Treasury under Lincoln, which is a huge deal, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. He was a senator, and he was also Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And so we'll talk a little bit about the Supreme Court in this era because it's a very, very interesting era for the Supreme Court. Either way, Salmon P. Chase was a member of it. During the war, they established the first income tax in America. While Salmon P. Chase was the Secretary of the Treasury under Lincoln, they established the first income tax to help pay for the war. And because there was a ton of rich industrialists in the North who had a lot of income but weren't paying the U.S. And also Salmon P. Chase, despite what a lot of people think, the whole "In God We Trust" on coinage started way back here with Salmon P. Chase. And yes, it didn't come into as far as like the Pledge of Allegiance and things like that until the 50s. But way back here, Salmon P. Chase was putting "In God We Trust" on the coinage. And so this brings us to Abraham Lincoln, the man himself, the man of the hour. I think now might be a good time to get to the board a little bit because we need to kind of talk about the coalition that made up Abraham Lincoln's party, the Republican Party. We've got Republicans here. And Republicans at this time are a mixture of Whigs and their Free Soilers. And so this is a very important coalition going into the Civil War. No, what's not here? No minorities, and there are very few poor white working class, which is what we're going to put here. No minorities and no members of the white working class here, which are some of the biggest voting bases in America. Now that we've got this up here, we can kind of look at Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln didn't want slaves, all right? And so there's a lot of confusion around how Abraham Lincoln felt about minority groups. Because sure, he didn't want slaves. That much is very true. But he was in support of the American Colonization Society, which wanted to move free slaves to Liberia. So he wasn't a fan of freeing the slaves and then having them actually participate in American society in any meaningful way. He wanted to free the slaves and let them go have their own country and do their own thing while we did our own thing here. This stems from his belief that slavery wasn't right and that the slaves were brought here against their will. And so he was in support of having them go back to where they came from in Africa, even though many of them didn't necessarily come from that area of Africa, and Africa's a huge place. But nonetheless, he wanted to send them there. He was a fan of this all the way through his time in politics as like a senator and a lawyer growing up. And he also had a massive opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected as the first Republican president. And his victory was entirely due to his support in the North, because no ballots were cast for him in 10 of the 15 southern slave states. And so Lincoln received about 40% of the vote in a four-way race. What's very interesting about that is we've got to understand who was allowed to vote at this time. And he only received 40% of the vote, which is a lot. It's a plurality. So that means he got quite a bit more than the others. He got a plurality, 40% out of 4 people, which isn't bad. But the only people that were allowed to vote at this time were white male landowners. It was not like poor people were actually in support of Lincoln at this time. He was a Civil War president, and another thing that kind of adds to this whole mythos of him being so anti-slavery, he was also in support of something called the Corwin Amendment. And so the Corwin Amendment would have enshrined slavery in the Constitution, but it wouldn't have allowed it to spread. So essentially, the Corwin Amendment would have said, hey, you slave states are allowed to have slaves, but no other slave states can exist going forward. And so Abraham Lincoln was all for this because he wanted to keep the Union together. He wanted to make sure that America as a country could go forward. And he saw the best way to do that would be to try to appease the South, essentially. This didn't work because the South wanted this. The South saw the writing on the wall, and they were like, we know that if the Corwin Amendment were to pass and it were to be that way, we would cease to exist in a few generations because they're not allowed to grow and they're not allowed to spread their ideas any further. We get the Civil War. And so the Civil War happens, and I think it's also very interesting to note here that Russia was the lone great power to initially support the Union in the Civil War. So it's kind of interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about Russia's relation with the Republican Party going forward, but it's very interesting that like right here at the very beginning, Russia's the only one that's supporting the Union right when it kicks out. Another very interesting thing that Lincoln did under his presidency was pack the courts, pack the Supreme Court. So essentially, he got to choose 5 justices himself, which is pretty whopping. He also was able to create the 10th Circuit, which allowed for another justice for a little bit before it went back down to the 9 justices under Grant. And Abraham Lincoln was also responsible for land grant policy. So like throughout the U.S., there are plenty of colleges, you probably have a few near you, that are all from these things called Morrill land grants, which were meant to boost education in engineering and agriculture. 2 things that this new union would desperately need after the Civil War, given that its agricultural region had just been pillaged, and its workforce completely rendered unworkable in a lot of ways. So we get Abraham Lincoln leading the Republican Party through the Civil War with a focus on getting rid of slaves, opening up new states that are going to be free, with a big emphasis on pushing forward industrialization, pushing forward the idea of engineering, agricultural studies, things like that. He did a lot of things that showed the desperation of the situation, I think, because he showed a lot of disdain for the norms of the era, which is another thing that I think we can attribute to the Republican Party as a whole, a lack of care for norms. And in this case, it was a good thing. I mean, we needed to get rid of slavery. Obviously, it's a very bad thing. But that's all he wanted. He didn't care about the people that were slaves. He cared that they were no longer slaves so that they could essentially further the country. Because the country had essentially for a very long time been at a deadlock about this slavery issue. Because there were so many people in the country that believed it was not a good thing, and there were so many people in the country that believed it was a good thing. And so Abraham Lincoln really wanted to push the country forward, and he wanted to solve the slave issue without having to deal with any of the political repercussions. Hence his massive support of just shipping them off all to Liberia. But post-Civil War, we get into the Reconstruction era. And so this is a very, very interesting era because federal troops were stationed throughout the South. Union troops were stationed throughout the South as political bodies, transportation points. They were everywhere to maintain order and maintain federal law. And most importantly, to maintain the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were collectively known as the Reconstruction Amendments. And so these amendments to the Constitution, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment gave citizenship to the newly freed slaves. And then the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote, not women yet. And so with these three, you've got the freedom of slaves, the citizenship of slaves, and the right of slaves to vote. And so there's no such thing as a slave anymore. Or is there? Because the 13th Amendment is a bit tricky, and we'll talk about it later. This Reconstruction era actually led to the first African Americans in Congress, ever, in government, ever. Notably, this was post-Civil War, and this was during Reconstruction when federal troops were in the South, forcing the amendments to be applied evenly and equally. And we get another very important character in the Republican diaspora. Because now that the Civil War is over, and slavery is abolished for the most part, minus a little tweak we'll talk about, all these people are citizens now, and they have the right to vote. And so these citizens that now have the right to vote exercised that right, and they elected a man named Hiram Rhodes Revels. And Hiram Rhodes Revels was a Republican politician and the first African American congressman in American history. He was freeborn in North Carolina. He was never a slave. He was freeborn to a family of freeborn. So, like, for several generations, they had been freeborn, which means that they were never slaves. And at least he was never a slave. And so he became a Methodist minister, and he briefly became imprisoned in Missouri in 1854 for preaching the gospel to Negroes through, "though I was never subjected to violence." That's what he said, in quote. But I think that calls back to our discussion about where black preachers were outlawed after Nat Turner's rebellion, and this is kind of an example of that. He fought in the Civil War on the side of the Union. Another thing that's important to note here is this is all prior to the 17th Amendment, and so he was elected senator, Hiram Rhodes was. And so the 17th Amendment led to the popular election of senators, but this was prior to that, so senators were still elected via state legislatures. State legislatures nominated and elected senators from the state to go represent them in the federal government. In 1870, Revels was elected by a vote of 81 to 15 in the Mississippi legislature to finish the term of one of the state's two seats that had been vacant since the Civil War. And since when Mississippi seceded from the Union, their seats were vacant in the federal legislature. And so after the Civil War, they had to elect new ones. And so he was elected for a term of 1 year just to finish out the term of the guy that stepped down after the secession of Mississippi. But what's very important about Hiram is he points out so many flaws in the Republican Party just right here. So he argued so something very interesting about Hiram is he argued for the amnesty and complete restoration of citizenship for Confederate soldiers, provided that they swore an oath of loyalty to the United States. And this was very interesting considering his status at the time. He was a black man who had just fought these soldiers in himself, He was in the war. He was on the Union side. And yet afterwards he says, these men need amnesty. We need them in our country. And as long as they're loyal, I will have them. He, as a black man, said that. And another thing, in 1875, this was after he had left the Senate and after he had seen the rise of the Republican Party, he wrote a letter in 1875 to Ulysses S. Grant. And he said that carpetbaggers were manipulating the black vote for personal benefit, and that the Republican Party was keeping alive wartime divisions. And so, to understand what this statement means, we kind of need to understand what a carpetbagger is. In this era after the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, the South was in ruins. The crops had been destroyed, the rail systems had been destroyed, the infrastructure had been literally ripped up and shredded and burnt. And carpetbaggers were these rich northern opportunists that came down to the war-torn South and took advantage of the war-torn situation. Instead of letting those populations have money or whatnot to rebuild their own society after large portions of their wealth had been ripped away. And another term that's brought up often in this era is a term called a scallywag. Essentially, this refers to a Southerner who supported Reconstruction and supported these northern carpetbaggers coming in. And so Hiram Rhodes immediately here was denouncing how the Republican Party was taking advantage of the situation to profit off of not only his people, but off the South in general. After Hiram and after the Reconstruction era, we get to a guy named Rutherford B. Hayes. And so Rutherford B. Hayes is very important because he is the reason that there is no longer, or that there was no longer Reconstruction. So let's talk about what he did. So Rutherford B. Hayes was in an election in 1876. This election was between him and a guy named Samuel Tilden, and this was a heavily disputed election. And Rutherford B. Hayes ended up losing the popular vote. But because of something called the Compromise of 1877, also known as the Corrupt Bargain, the Electoral College, this is an informal and unwritten deal, but the Electoral College agreed that we will allow Rutherford B. Hayes to become president, even though he lost the popular vote, in exchange for federal troops leaving the South. And so Hayes was then awarded the presidency in exchange for withdrawing these federal troops from the South. And this effectively ended Reconstruction and allowed the Southern Democrats to regain control of the politics down there. People called this the corrupt bargain because sure, it let Republicans stay in power, but it also initiated Jim Crow. We can see right here that this corrupt bargain that the Republicans made to stay in power heavily emphasized the point that they wanted money over minorities. And so this is a constant theme, and it starts with Rutherford B. Hayes, but the idea that the Republican Party throughout its entire history has chosen money over minorities every time. Every single time. And we see it right here, where the South was under control of the federal government. Their troops were down there maintaining Reconstruction amendments, maintaining the rights of African Americans under those provisions, allowing people like Hiram to become elected to the legislature for the first time in history, all to just be thrown away in exchange for power and in exchange for maintaining control over not only just the federal government, but the federal economy. With that in mind, we get Jim Crow laws in the South, which outside of this Reconstruction era, you will not see another African American politician until the Civil Rights Movement. And it all has to do with the simple fact that the Republicans chose control, power, influence, and money over the rights of the minority groups here. With that, we get to the idea of a robber baron. These industrialists, who were these people making these decisions? And so the Republican Party, at its very founding, had an idea. And that idea was free soil, free labor, free men, and they wanted to expand banking, expand railroads, expand factories, and this kind of can be summed up with the idea of big banks, big factories, big railroads. And we get the Gilded Age, which is a period in American history from the 1870s to the 1890s, where these Republicans had chosen money over minorities. And we get the likes of these corporatists that start rising, these robber baron industrialists. And we see slowly their capture of politics. We can start off by looking at a guy named John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller got his money selling supplies to the Union soldiers during the war. He sold food and all sorts of provisions that they would need to beat the South back. And furthermore, in 1860, during the 1860 oil rush, he saw the opportunity to strike it even more rich, and he used all of his money that he had gained providing provisions to the Union Army to found Standard Oil in 1870. John D. Rockefeller was a devout Northern Baptist, kind of like what we talked about before, with this split between North and South and what a Baptist is. John D. Rockefeller was one of these Baptists. He was a Northern Baptist, and he heavily funded the Republicans, and he treated workers very poorly. He created the idea of a trust, which is essentially a corporation of corporations. So it's like one company that owns a bunch of companies. And we're going to talk about the idea of industrialists or corporatists later, and I want to make a whole video about corporatists and their influence on American politics. But this Gilded Age is truly defined by them. Another figure in this era is J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan comes from massive wealth in the merchant banking industry, which was established in England. And in the Panic of 1893, J.P. Morgan came to save the day. So essentially, all the Panic of 1893 was poor people had silver, and they wanted the government to give them gold in exchange for their silver, because gold is the wanted material, the valuable thing. And so the government ran out of gold because all these people were exchanging in their silver for gold. A huge problem started developing where the treasury had nothing in it to back up the currency. And so what happened was the government sold bonds to Morgan in exchange for gold that he held in private banks. And this massive influx of gold into the market plummeted the price of silver, but it stabilized the treasury. So an important aspect of J.P. Morgan is he heavily supported Republicans, heavily supported McKinley, because McKinley was a big supporter of the gold standard, and you can kind of guess who had the gold. J.P. Morgan and his banker friends had all the gold. And it's also important to notice that J.P. Morgan wasn't like a northern saint per se. Like, he owned several banks in the South as well, and those banks commonly accepted slaves as collateral in exchange for loans. So he was just as much into this situation of corruption and money as anybody else. And we can clearly see that he cared much more about money than he did about the minority social aspects of the time. Furthermore, J.P. Morgan also funded Tesla, funded a massive, not Tesla the company, Tesla the man. And so that's very interesting, and we can kind of go on to infinite rabbit holes about conspiracy theories here. But I'll suffice it to say that Nikola Tesla was eventually After his death, all of his things were taken by none other than a member of the Trump family. So that's a very interesting thing to think about, that way back here, the Trump family was involved in Republican politics in a way. J.P. Morgan also, he purchased tons of steel companies from Andrew Carnegie, who's another figure in this time. He was an Episcopalian, and in 1907 he solved another crisis where essentially he had to conglomerate a bunch of bankers together in order to back up with their own personal wealth the loans that the banks had made, because essentially a bunch of people had been betting on the stock market and they didn't have the money when their bets didn't panned out, and the banks were the ones actually betting all this money, because all these people were betting on margin or on the bank's dime. And so when all these people lost all their money, the banks therefore lost all their money, and so there was a huge crisis. And again, J.P. Morgan, with his vast personal wealth and network of other people that also had vast personal wealth, were able to essentially prop up the American economy again. Now that we've kind of talked about the robber barons, or these industrialists and their influence on the Republican Party, we can now go on and move to talk about William McKinley. This was one of the men that all these rich people were funding. And so William McKinley won the election of 1896, where he was completely funded by robber barons, these super wealthy elites, corporatists. And so he was essentially a member of what a lot of people refer to as the first modern primary, because he had to compete for the Republican seat from a lot of different individuals that wanted it. And how he was able to win this is he essentially just lied to people. Throughout the primaries, he literally just told people that were in support of the silver standard that he was in support of the silver standard, and then people that were in support of the gold standard, he was like, I'm also in support of the gold standard. But because of how the media was at the time, this person and this person didn't ever really talk, so he could get away with it until later when investigators came in and were like trying to figure out what historians came in and trying to figure out what's going on. Another big aspect of William McKinley's campaign is he stayed at home and had reporters come to him, and then these reporters would then go out and tell everybody what he said. This ended up winning him the election. And notably, Warren G. Harding worked on McKinley's campaign and was one of these people that went out and told the world what William McKinley was saying. Furthermore, he promised that high tariffs would bring prosperity. Because that's another thing that we'll begin to see over and over again, is Republicans often promise prosperity, and because they're super wealthy, they often can trick people into thinking that they too can be super wealthy. And another important thing William McKinley did is he annexed Hawaii. And so this is another hint at that corporate takeover of politics, because I don't want to go into the complete history of Hawaii, but suffice it to say, Mr. Dole had a lot to do with the dethroning of the monarchy there. William McKinley was funded by robber barons, supported corporate takeovers of countries, lied to people about his economic views. And as you can see, this probably didn't make a lot of people happy. And so William McKinley was actually assassinated. William McKinley was assassinated by Leon Shklovskaz, or whatever the heck his name is. But this guy was a white working class wire worker. And he assassinated William McKinley because he felt that William McKinley was not representing the working class at all, and there was a lot of people hurting. All the things we've talked about may seem pretty good. We've got Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation, a house divided cannot stand, all these great lines from Abraham Lincoln. But then we quickly saw how these idealistic things of the freedom of slavery, African Americans' rights, quickly crumbled the moment that Abraham Lincoln was no longer in office. And Abraham Lincoln was also assassinated. Everybody already knows that, that's why I didn't talk about it too much earlier. John Wilkes Booth, also representative of the South and these white Southerners. But either way, we see that shortly after Lincoln's death, the Republican Party, as Haram says, quickly starts taking advantage of people, quickly starts abusing the power that they have. And quickly, we see two new forms of slavery rise directly from the ashes of the Civil War. We get corporate slavery with these massive corporations and poor working conditions, corporate capture of politics. You get this whole idea of a wage slave. And these corporatists are largely still to this day the largest influence on politics. And we can talk, like I said, we're going to make a whole video about corporatists and their situation and where they came from, their beliefs, and where they are now. But for right now, we can suffice to say that in the ashes of the Civil War, we get a form of slavery known as corporate slavery or wage slavery. And then also we get, because of the 13th Amendment, slavery as a punishment. So despite what these great ideals were after the Civil War, they didn't actually solve the problems that you'd think. They just kind of created new ones, which is often the case because the world is such a complicated place and there's always going to be problems. Because if I think something's good, somebody else is going to think it's bad, even if it's the best for them too. There's no such thing really as an objective reality, because no matter what I say the objective reality is, somebody will argue it. And those people still get to make decisions, still get to vote, still get to participate, because they are human. And they have the right to exist just as much as I do. The idea of the prison industrial complex popped up because of this 13th Amendment, but it dates before that. So the 13th Amendment happened in 1865, but the first prison that was owned by a private corporation and had laborers to generate wealth was in 1844, when Louisiana State Penitentiary was leased to James A. McHatton and William Pratt for a 5-year period, and they used the prisoners there to generate wealth and to make things and all this. At the time, in 1844, the prisoners were white. All of them were white. I mean, a lot of that has to go back to the idea of that Louisiana was a slave state, essentially, is what it comes back to. And white prisons, there didn't need to be prisons for slaves, essentially. But by the time 1865 comes around, that prison, the same prison, Louisiana State Penitentiary, is vast majority African American. So in just a period of 20 years, because of this 13th Amendment, we see a drastic change in prison population. And so even to this day, the prison industrial complex is majority minority groups, and the people profiting off of it are largely white. This brings us these two new forms of slavery and kind of discontentment with the vast amount of wealth being poured into the Republican Party and the Republican Party's disdain of the working class, the poor people. You kind of get this guy named Teddy Roosevelt. And so Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. And he rose up in the Republican Party because of its good aspects, because of those things we talked about, like they freed the slaves, they were They wanted the new territories to not have slavery. And Teddy Roosevelt supported minority rights. And so this kind of had him at odds with the members of the Republican Party. And so Teddy Roosevelt had a massive support from the working class. This kind of stemmed from him being a war hero. As we've kind of seen with Andrew Jackson, war heroes are often looked very fondly upon by the working class because they see themselves in those people, because it's the working class that are the ones that have to fight these wars. He appealed very heavily to these working class people, and Teddy Roosevelt became a massive figurehead for the working class and for minority rights. And he hated the corruption that he was seeing in the Republican Party. And because of this, he became disillusioned with the Republican Party, and he founded his own party, which was the Progressive Party. And by founding the Progressive Party, we kind of need to go back to the board to see what's happening here. Because this is another big area where we see a lot of confusion. So if we look back up here, we have the Republicans, and the Whigs are no longer a thing. So who's making up the Republican Party right now in early 1900s? We have corporatists, and then over here we have another group. So these were people that believed in the federal government, and then they had corporatists who believed that their money should run everything, essentially. And they didn't care about the working class. So let's talk about a group that they don't have leading up to Teddy Roosevelt. They didn't have working class, they didn't have minorities. So what do? We get an interesting thing here, because this is not enough people to actually win the election. And so the Republican Party has morphed into only accepting these people. So they're at kind of a standstill. So they don't know what to do. Then we get this guy named Teddy Roosevelt who comes in here, and he's going to come from this group of people here. Teddy also supports the federal government because Teddy was in a big fight with the Spanish-American War. He was a war hero. And so he was in support of the federal government. He believed in the federal government and what it stood for. What he didn't like were these people, and he didn't like that these people were taking advantage of these people. And so what does Teddy do? Teddy Roosevelt comes in. The Republicans choose Teddy Roosevelt because Teddy Roosevelt can get the working class and he can get minority, which is a much bigger voting base than these rich corporatists. And so the Republicans see this and they get Teddy Roosevelt because they believe that Teddy Roosevelt, and he also has this group, strong support of federal government. And they choose Teddy Roosevelt because he can get these groups of people. But this group of people ends up becoming very dissatisfied with Teddy Roosevelt. And here's what happened. Yeah, let's do this. We have Republicans. Under the Republicans, we have McKinley, who represents big corporate. And then over here we have Teddy Roosevelt, who represents strong federal government, minorities. So when McKinley dies, he gets assassinated by some of these working class people. Teddy Roosevelt briefly becomes vice president because after McKinley dies, so Teddy is forced to come up and be vice president. Anyway, so Teddy Roosevelt represents a much different group in the Republican Party than McKinley did, is essentially the point I'm getting. Teddy Roosevelt was allowed to rise up because he was a war hero, and the Republicans already trusted him because he was vice president prior. What's important is the Republicans chose Teddy Roosevelt because they didn't see a lot of options. They didn't see how their massive corporations that were funding their political engine were able to continue going without the support of the working class and the minorities. And so they ran Teddy Roosevelt. And so Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican president for a while, but he became disillusioned with all the corruption in the party. and created something called the Progressive Party. So the Republicans all of these guys were Republicans. So Republicans were made up of all these people. They were made up of the corporatists, then they were made up of supporters of the government, the federal government. They had minorities, and then they had the working class. So what happens here? Teddy Roosevelt becomes mad at this group of people because this group of people is paying for everything. Even though they're a very small number of voters, they have all the wealth. And so Teddy Roosevelt begins an active campaign of trust busting. So a nickname for Teddy Roosevelt is the Trust Buster. So because he busted trusts, he ticked off all these big corporates. He busted the trusts, and he instead took all these guys and founded his own party known as the Progressive Party. And so the Progressive Party split the Republican vote. And because of that, after Teddy Roosevelt, you get Democrats in power. And so the Democrats take power after Teddy Roosevelt because he splits the party and he upset the Republican elite. Furthermore, Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to ever settle a labor dispute in 1902, the 1902 coal strike. And he also spoke against what he called malefactors of great wealth, aka these industrialists, robber barons, corporatist goons that were running the party. Let's figure out what happened here. Because after Teddy Roosevelt, he founded his own party, split the Republican vote. The Republican Party was still around. It still exists to this very day. So what happened? Who was left in the Republican after the split? After the split from the Republican Party by the Progressive Party, all you have is essentially the corporatists. And the corporatists don't really know what to do because they don't have a lot of voting base, because all they have are these corporatists. So they find a guy named Warren G. Harding. And Warren G. Harding was the next Republican president after Woodrow Wilson. We can kind of talk about here in the early 1920s, we see a lot of Republican gaming, essentially. Warren G. Harding was elected in 1920. He was a Republican, but more importantly, I think, in this instance, is he supported women's suffrage. And he was a Northern Baptist. So let's go back to the board. I know you probably hate the board, but we can talk about a group of people that the Republicans now have that the Democrats didn't have, and they weren't really in support of it. So the Republicans in 1920 had two voting groups now. They had corporatists, and then here they had women. And the woman's role in politics is very, very, very interesting. And a lot of people may ask why the Republicans got them and not the Democrats. And I think this has a lot to do with the women's suffrage movement and who was in charge of it and things like that. And I want to do a whole video about the women's suffrage movement, but suffice it to say that women were very much so in favor of prohibition. And so we're getting into the era of prohibition. So like I said, after Teddy Roosevelt and the party split, the Republican Party didn't really know what to do because they didn't have a lot of voters and they didn't have a lot of power left because of that. So how did they find Warren G. Harding? Well, it's actually very mysterious. Republican leaders met in what they call the smoke-filled room and decided out of a slew of candidates to pick Warren G. Harding as their nominee because of his political and religious affiliations. Because Harding was involved in the Republican Party and he was well connected with these rich people, the corporatists, and he also had the religious backing of being a Northern Baptist, which they believed would help push him over the top. In the election of Warren G. Harding, it's very notable that he's still a continuation of this corporatist, secretly selected sort of idea. FDR Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who we'll talk about a little bit, was actually the running mate to be vice president on the Democratic ticket in this election. So already right now we can see that the Democrats have started taking in the progressives from earlier. Warren G. Harding appointed a guy named Andrew Mellon as his Secretary of Treasury. You guys have probably heard of Carnegie Mellon University or the like, and he's another just very rich industrial corporatist at this time. Also, notably, I guess here is Warren G. Harding supported trade with the new USSR directly after it was formed, and so that's interesting to think about given the last time we talked about Russia briefly. They were the only ones to support us initially, support the Union initially in the Civil War. So we see another Russian connection right here in the Republican Party, and we'll continue to see more Russian connections to the Republican Party as we go forward. So Warren G. Harding also caused a lot of racial tensions because he did very little, if anything, after the Tulsa Race Massacre. He essentially, during this time, allowed, not necessarily all him, but it did nothing to prevent the expansion of the Ku Klux Klan during this time. And so the Ku Klux Klan and all these other white supremacist groups were forming and doing horrible things in the South and in the North, but throughout the 20s, the Ku Klux Klan became one of the largest groups of Americans, up to millions of members. So after Warren G. Harding, we get Calvin Coolidge. And so Calvin Coolidge was a president of the Roaring Twenties. He was the first vice president to ever attend cabinet meetings under Warren G. Harding. And so there's so much conspiracy you can dig in here about Warren G. Harding's mysterious death and Calvin Coolidge's rise to power. But Silent Cal is what he was known as, and he's known as saying, "The words of a president have an enormous weight and ought not to be used indiscriminately." And so he rarely gave huge speeches and all this, but his Secretary of Commerce was a guy named Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover is a super wealthy individual, and he was appointed Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge, and he essentially spent money, like it was going out of style, on trying to expand the industrialization of the United States. Calvin Coolidge hated government regulation, and he refused to help struggling farmers because he believed that they should be able to essentially help themselves, which is a common thing that you'll also see from Herbert Hoover. He also refused to condemn the Klan as it was rising, and specifically the Klan had completely taken over the Republican Party in Indiana at this time. And so a big term that came to be known in this era is WASP, which stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And this became a huge voter base within the Republican Party because they did not like Catholics. They didn't like anybody that wasn't a Protestant. And so they formed themselves into this coalition within the Republican Party at this time. And Calvin Coolidge accepted it, essentially. Another very important figure under Calvin Coolidge is a guy named J. Edgar Hoover. I really don't want to dive into the conspiracy surrounding him right now, but suffice to say he was appointed under Coolidge and stayed in that position until 1972 when he died. And we can talk, I want to do a whole video on what is the deep state and what we mean when we say that. But suffice to say, this is the beginning of that whole FBI controlling everything idea. It starts with J. Edgar Hoover and under Calvin Coolidge. And there's tons of conspiracies about that, and we can dig into all of that at another date. So all of this corruption, essentially, and all of this idea of money over minorities led to the Great Depression, essentially. So Hoover, Herbert Hoover, not J. Edgar Hoover, came in to be president after Coolidge. Herbert was an incredibly wealthy individual, and he continued to suck money from the American economy, and essentially said that rugged individualism and pulling yourself up from your bootstraps essentially is what's going to make America better, what's going to solve all our problems. And upon taking office, he's quoted as saying, "Given the chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation." And then the stock market crashed by the end of that year, in an event known as Black Tuesday, and this kicked off the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover did a lot of very bad things as far as the poor working class. He essentially was America's equivalent to like let them eat cake until maybe Trump right now. But he used the military to disperse World War I veterans instead of paying them in an event known as the Bonus Army or the Bonus March. He turned U.S. troops on veterans who were trying to get paid because America didn't have the money. So we end up, after Hoover, with Democratic control of the system. In 1928, Hoover carried 43 states out of 50, and then in 1932, Hoover carried just 6. In fact, Hoover, appealing to this Protestant work ethic, helped him actually crack what was called the Solid South, which had only voted Democrat until Hoover. And because Hoover appealed to like Protestant work ethic, he was the first first Republican able to crack Democratic control of the South. However, we see that just 4 years later, the entire country turned Democratic except for 6 states, which were all wealthy states in New England. And we have Democratic control under FDR until Richard Nixon. We get Richard Nixon, and he's able to take control of the Republican Party, able to re-control the White House because of something called the silent majority. And we talked about the silent majority briefly in our last video, but suffice it to say the silent majority is very, very important to the Republican base right now, and is essentially a group of white people that didn't vote before because of access, means, religious beliefs, various things. And he went down there and convinced them all to vote. And essentially this allowed him to rehabilitate the Republican Party. However, that also wouldn't last long because he immediately becomes involved in something called the Watergate scandal, which I know you've all heard about. But he essentially spies on the Democratic Party, and it causes a big rigmarole. Because of this, and because of the Democrats choosing a Southern Baptist, they're able to win the next election with Jimmy Carter. However, it isn't long-lived because the Republicans could see what was happening, and they realized that they needed to take control of the Southern Baptists and other evangelical groups politically in order to win. And we already know that they have foregone the use of minority votes in exchange for money over minorities. And we get Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan is an exact spawn of the moral majority, which we talked briefly about in our last video. But essentially the moral majority is this idea that the Southern Baptists have a belief system that not just the Southern Baptists, but these extremist evangelical religious groups all have, primarily the Southern Baptists, all have this certain moral framework that they believe the world should go by. And so Jerry Falwell pops in here and he's like, see these people, Jimmy Carter, see what he did? He's not us. He says he's us, but he's not us. We are the moral ones. See all this liberal progressive stuff he's doing? We don't want that. We want what we consider to be our morality, our instilled morality we get from our religion. And so we are going to use that to push our beliefs onto the rest of the country. And so we get Falwell and we get people like Paul Pressler all pushing in the South to get Ronald Reagan elected. And so once Ronald Reagan is elected, he essentially starts the war on drugs, which is another way that the Republican Party has heightened racial tension, and is another direct spawn of that moral majority idea. Now we get into the Bushes. So we have H.W. Bush, and he was responsible for so much stuff. And again, we're going to make a video about the deep state, but he was director of the CIA under Gerald Ford, and he became vice president under Reagan, and then he became president. He's a product of the same moral majority schema, and his son was chosen after Bill Clinton. And we talked briefly about Bill Clinton and how he was able to hijack the same voting base as Ronald Reagan, and how he was able to do that through his tough on crime, religious appeal, stuff like that. And so in order to run against that, they pushed Bush 2.0, Little Bush, and he started what they called the War on Terror, which is another obscure war that just served to heighten racial tensions and expand corporate interests. So both the War on Drugs and the War on Terror can both be seen as a similar thing as far as pushing racial minorities away from the Republican Party even further. And then finally we get to Donald Trump. And there's so much we can talk about with Donald Trump. But essentially Donald Trump is the product of using spiritual hijacking of these evangelical groups, combining the base idea of the moral majority and applying a messiah figure to it. And while also tapping into McKinley-era corporatist backing and also a massive focus on suppression of what Trump calls the deep state, or the idea of draining the swamp or whatnot. Trump is a direct response to a lot of these like weird ties to the CIA and FBI that many have perceived to like actually run the country. And we can talk about how this is actually just Trump's ideological argument about how the constitutional American system is not as good as his new system that he's trying to build. And I want to talk about all these figures that helped to establish Trump as the figure he is today. And I want to talk a little bit about like the family. I want to talk about these new age robber barons, often referred to as technocrats or the broligarchy. And I want to talk about how Trump is an engine for these groups of people to create essentially this theo-technocracy with this infallible God King at the top that essentially has no reason to listen to the people anymore, you know? And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but let's suffice to say Trump is a culmination of fears and groups of people that have formed over time. And we can see why he chose the Republican Party, because the Republican Party has some of the most straightforward paths to power, and they kind of rely almost entirely on the amount of money you have in the amount you're willing to pander toward religious groups. It's essentially the two things that the Republican Party currently has are money, elite corporate backing, and this theocratic backing from the far right evangelicals. And I want to talk about how I want to make a video all about this deep state and its connection to the Trump. And then I want to make a video about the theocratic angles to Trump. And then I want to talk about the political, like a political video about what is the secular government system that they're trying to destroy. Like, what is this American constitutional system I'm referencing, often referred to as like the American civil religion by people like Robert Bellah. But essentially, I want to talk about the thing Trump's fighting against and the powers that are supporting it. And I think that's a good place to end, because we can see how we got to where we are as far as the Republican Party. But it still doesn't quite explain Trump as a figure entirely, and I want to make some more videos, like I said, explaining the Trump phenomenon. But I do think that he's not entirely a unique beast in terms of Republican politics. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you next time.